right, 1 Timothy 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2. All right, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to spend about 2 weeks in each chapter. I knew I would need 3 for this chapter, but, I'm confident we can get through it the next 2 weeks. And that'll, with some of the other breaks this summer, that'll get us through August. But, we'll see. I do want to cover next week the second half of the last few verses in verses 11 through 15. I think I didn't want to tackle too much because I do think we got to set up. Everybody wants to get into verses 11 through 15 about you women. And what's the deal there? And what about that? And is it cultural? And is it for all time for the church? And all of the issues, what does it mean? And can they do this? And can they do that? And is it a sin if they, and all these questions that people, and are we misogynistic? And are we, do we have, toxic, masculinity and all the, patriarchal. I remember I was called that a few years ago by a young lady that said, well, that's your patriarchal bias speaking. And I said, oh, okay. And so I guess that's what I have. And so we'll talk about that more next week. And but we do need to set it up a little bit in verses 8 through 10. So 1 Timothy 2, verses 8 through 10. Let me see if this is... All right. So Paul is going to get into the second disturbance that's going on in the church. So we've talked about the first one in chapter 1. Remember, this is the immediate that there is. He left him in Ephesus and Macedonia that he would command certain people not to teach false doctrine or devote themselves to myths, endless genealogies. Such things promote controversial speculations rather than advancing God's work. And so the first crisis, the first threat was these false teachers, false teaching. And it was producing division. It was producing disharmony. If the church is not united, we can't do anything else. We're really not going to be good for anything else. And so this is the first great threat, the first great disturbance that he deals with. And so he rooted it in the gospel that we talked about, and then some other matters. And then in chapter 2, beginning in verses 1 through 7, he begins giving some instructions for public worship. And, he's going to we talked about prayer and the different words for prayer, and when we pray for all people. And we remember God's plan is to save everyone. No one is beyond reach, including false teachers, including the worst of sinners that Paul says, I'm the worst. And so God's plan of salvation. And so now, beginning in verse 8, through the end of the chapter, he's going to talk about this second disturbance. And let me see if this is... I'm going to turn this monitor on. Bottom. Yeah. He can't do anything. Is that? Sorry about that. Is it not? There we go. All right. Thanks, Matt. We couldn't do it without you. I don't care what others say. No. Okay, so Paul's going to deal with these disturbances. And keep in mind, the the women, they get the focus, but it is men and women who are both causing the disruption here in Ephesus. And so he's already talked about these false teachers, these individuals who are causing disruption. They're causing controversy, and controversy produces division. It produces, he's going to talk about anger here in just a moment. And so he's first talked to these men and in a negative way. Now he's going to kind of, try to present it here first, kind of a positive and then a little bit of negative. And so let's go ahead and read this here. Someone read 8 through 10, 1 Timothy 2. Okay, Ron. Okay, so, and there's a parallel with verses 1 and verse 8. I urge, first of all, that petitions and prayer, and now in verse 8 he says, therefore I want all men everywhere to pray. So you see the parallel there with these two verses about public prayer, and that's my interpretation, I think, from the context and from understanding this in the best way, that although all of this would apply to your own individual lives, certainly he's dealing with the corporate aspect of the church, the public nature of the church in the assembly in particular. And so we'll have to keep that in mind. He says, again, there's going to be two parts to this, the positive and the negative. He first says, I would, and some of the translations say that I want men in every place. The NIV leaves out the place, which I think is a little bit unfortunate, because I think that's the idea here. That's that Dr. Everett Ferguson was a longtime professor at Abilene Christian, was a foremost expert on first century, the church in the first century, wrote a lot of volumes and was just a world-renowned scholar. And he describes this in one of his books, how this was a technical term that drew from the Old Testament in regard to the synagogue and the temple, and Paul taps into that here in this word. And so the idea here is that in every place of meeting of the church, this is the idea. And you see this in the book of Acts when they came together, and they were all in one place, when the church is assembling. Again, outside of that, yes, absolutely, these principles and things are important, but this technical aspect of this, what Paul is saying is, here's what I want, here's what I'm asking, here's what I'm commanding, here's what I'm saying, is that when the church assembles, when the church gathers in every place, and I think this puts it beyond the local congregation at Ephesus. Paul will often speak about this. One thing that I wrote to the church of Galatia, I write to you, 1 Corinthians 16, now concerning the collection of the saints, as I wrote to the churches of Galatia. And so Paul will say often in these letters that this is also instruction that I've given for the church everywhere. And I think that's the best way to understand that here, because there's, and we're going to talk a little bit about the other viewpoint next week, because I do want to be honest and fair, because it is a complex issue when you deal with the role of women and the assembly, and what are women doing and what can women not do, and you got to be honest about 1 Corinthians 14, what's going on in the church at Corinth when he talks about women praying and prophesying with their heads uncovered. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about that and some of the other viewpoint that has some legitimate counterpoint. But I think it's best to understand it in this regard, that this is not just a cultural, limited to the church at Ephesus only, that you find this as in all the saints, as in all the churches, 1 Corinthians and other places that Paul is giving these instructions, that when the church meets, this is what I'm teaching, this is what I'm instructing, that the men would would do this. And again, we'll talk about this prohibition. We'll talk about how it's not an absolute prohibition in every way, every sense, and so on. Again, we'll come back to that next week. But he says, I want the men to pray. Again, I think it's not just Ephesus, but I think it's every church, that I want the men to pray. He says, I want, it means I intend, I plan, I'm deciding. This is strong apostolic language. This is what I want to happen. This is my instructions. Remember what he says in chapter 3, verse 14 and 15. I'm writing to you these instructions that I can come to you soon, but if I'm delayed, you would know how you ought to conduct yourself, what? In the house of God. Specifically when the church gathers together in worship and in their organization. And so this is what he calls for. Okay, lifting holy hands. You talk about a lot of just discussion that I think at the end really doesn't matter. I think it's been over holy hands. Someone says, is it physical posture? Is it spiritual posture? Is it both? Yes, there you go. It was certainly one way that they would pray with their palms extended. And so have at it. There's nothing wrong with praying this way. And so, again, is it the emphasis on spiritual? Because he says, lift up what kind of hands? Holy. And we're going to talk about that here in just a minute, about what this division is causing amongst the men, amongst the congregation. It's causing anger and quarreling. And so the emphasis is on when you represent God's people, when you stand up and lead prayer, that you do this in a way that is honoring God, that is holy to God, that is uniting God's people. And so, again, I think that, it's physical posture, spiritual is as well the emphasis. And so, because notice what he says here. He says it's without anger or disputing. What are these controversies? What are these quarreling, these arguments causing? Division. And that starts with anger. I mean, when people argue I'm not talking about a good, healthy discussion and the ideas and that kind of traditional sense of the debate, but when we see most arguing and quarreling and controversial back and forth, what does it usually produce? What is it usually produced in you when you're in the break room or you're on social media and you hear and you read something that is controversial, that is combative, that is argumentative? What feelings does that usually generate in you? Warmth, loving, kind. Doesn't it produce that? No. What's it produce? I mean, have you ever had to I got to walk away? I mean, I've had people that tell me, what I mentioned last week, maybe going to get myself in trouble going into the election year next year. I mean, it's been rough for people these last 2 or 3 election years or so, because you can't, people have had to say, I've had to just walk out of the room. It is going to produce in me something that is not good. I'm going to say something. I'm going to lash out. Both sides. I don't care what position or where you're at. Often these controversies, these arguments produce nothing but anger. And I'm going to tell you, in my years of living, being a minister now for 23 years, that's exactly right. I have seen, I have heard, you can't name it. And what it generally produces in the church and what it generally produces in Christians is anger and hostility and resentment and bitterness, which leads ultimately to what? Division. Because I don't like, I'm sitting over here. That's what it leads to. Again, I'm not saying, Robert, saying we can't healthily, publicly, and discuss truth, and I'm not saying that. But this is what often is what it divulges into, and that's what's going on here, and that is spilled over into these men who are praying. And I've seen it, by the way. I've seen that pulpit, not necessarily not that pulpit. I ain't been here that long, but maybe some of you have that's been here a long time. But I've seen it in the church where even the pulpit is used to what? Get at people. Have you ever seen it done that way? Before I pray, I'd like to say something. Before I read this scripture, and it's pointed, it's stirring people up. I've got the bully what? What do we call that? Now I take advantage of that, I guess, every week. It's called a bully what? Pulpit, because you have the what? You've got the floor. You've got a position to exercise over somebody who necessarily can't. I mean, they can, but they look really bad if they yell back, and So I've seen that in the church, and whether it's doctrinally or personality or politically, I mean, I've seen that used even in the public assembly. Anybody else have a comment, question? Yeah, Jeff?
When I was in high school, I went to church right there in Lordton, and it was after I graduated from high school, and my dad had been an elder there, and he said that he was just holding the peace. And I literally was sitting in church on a Sunday morning, and when the preacher got up, there'd been a lady that got divorced and wanted to place membership and some degree. I literally saw people, in a sense, cussing at each other in the church after the Lord's Supper. And now there are three churches of Christ
Yeah.
because of that. But it was just like, as Christians, to see that was
Yeah.
terrible.
And this goes very against what God wants in the assembly, and so that's why the emphasis on that which is holy, that which brings people together, God's people coming together, and not be against each other. And so when you lead in this communal prayer, take note of that. And take note of that. I think our men do here an excellent job, but we always need that reminder that what we say and what we pray about, it is to be the uplifting and the building up and the unifying of the church, and not to some sort of stirring each other up or controversy. And I think that's a good reminder again. Yes, go ahead, Jeff. Yeah, right. A lot of collateral damage probably to a lot of souls, a lot of people. Yeah, and that people have saw that, and especially young people and the lost. And so he emphasizes that here. Now he mentions the negative. Again, we kind of talked about this anger. It's a settled, active anger. This is not a spike in the moment where someone just kind of, this is a settled, active hostility that you have towards a brother. And of course, I thought about the words, we're not going to read it, but what did Jesus talk about? Now, that's a passage that is misunderstood to some degree. He says if you're there about to present your offering at the altar, and you remember that your what? Your brother has something against you. Now, it is not just talking about, somebody's upset with me. Somebody doesn't agree with me. Somebody, it's actually talking about a sin that you have violated God's command. You have slandered. You have robbed. You have cheated. You have lied. It's not necessarily saying, Ron and I, we just didn't agree the other day about something. And you have to be careful with that passage because it can be misused in that sense. Someone being offended or being upset with you every time, I'm going to have to drop my worship and go run and talk to him. I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. He's talking about you've sinned against your brother. You've committed a violation of God's will, and you need to stop what you're doing in that worship, and you need to go be reconciled. That's what is holy, if you will. And I think Paul is echoing in on that as well here in this. You're not to have this hatred and this anger towards your brother in this regard. Without quarreling, again, without anger or without disputing or quarreling, this spirit of controversy. Often it is rooted in the spirit of controversy in an attitude that will not let go of something. You ever seen that with somebody? When something is controversial, have you noticed that with some people? And again, 23 years in the church, I don't care what subject I'm talking about or been preaching on or teaching on, there are certain individuals in the church, no matter what I'm talking about, they can bring it back to their favorite what? Controversial subject, topic. Well, preacher, that's kind of like nowadays with and they can just, everything comes back to that controversy. It's kind of like, and it can be for a positive thing too. I mean, even a positive subject, like the old joke about the preacher that always preached on baptism, and after weeks and weeks, his elders said, hey, can you preach on Genesis 1 and the creation? Okay, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, and that leads us to our subject of the waters of baptism. I mean, you get it every time, right? And when people have this spirit of controversy, I don't know about you, but my experience is they will not let it go. And what does that do to the rest of us that are sitting there? just enough. I know your view. I know you believe this way. And again, we can come under the guise of, well, it's truth. I believe it's truth with all my heart. I'm sincere. But is it producing what? Is it edifying? Is it building up? Is it And so that's what is not going on here at Ephesus. And so he says, you've got to get rid of this. And remember what James talks about in James chapter 4. Got to watch my time here. He says, I think I got to remember this. Let's read what James says here. James 4, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within? You desire but do not have, so you kill. Now, I don't think he's literally talking about in the church there. They were killing each other, physically murdering. I don't think that's what he's doing. I think he's talking about this anger, this hatred, this division. You covet, but you cannot have, you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask it with the wrong motive. If God were to give you something good, you'd just misuse it, and you would harm others and tear others down. And so I'm reminded of that in James 4 when he tells us where fights come from. They come from the passions. And again, people are very passionate about what? Their opinions, their feelings, their convictions. And if we're not careful, we can let those passions get the what of us? Get the best of us, so that it just, consumes everybody else around us. And so I think some of that would, on some of controversial stuff, quit listening to it so much. I remember talking to somebody years ago, and I said, what do you do all day? And he told me, I watch news channel, this particular news, and I listen to this radio, talk radio. Well, no wonder. You're listening to that 12 hours a day. And you can do that round the clock, and it can keep your passions and you're just stirred up, and then you're going to want to give that, unleash that on others, and nobody's going to be for the better. And so he says, this is what's important in the assembly. Okay, verse 9 here. Okay, we just got to get into the women now. So I know verse 8, you're like, okay, yeah, let's get to verse 9. No, we're going to spend some time here on the men too, so you don't come back and say I was just on the women. But everybody wants to talk about the women in these verses. And likewise, in the same way, in the same light. And so what is happening with these men and what Paul is saying is now going to apply to the women. And so he's going to say here, I also want the women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles, gold, pearls, or expensive clothing. Let's look around here, ladies, see who's got them on, some of you might be in trouble here. Well, what's Paul talking about? What's Paul not talking about? And there was I thought I had that. It's on the next slide. Let me skip ahead here because I did have that. We'll come back. What have we talked about? What was in the city of Ephesus? This model scale of once the what? Yeah, well, that's the temple to Diana, and so Artemis, and so this was the very center of Ephesus. This very booming commercial, religious port there was very, very important. And let me see here. Yeah, Gary Hogan, his book describes wealth in the ancient Ephesus, and he taps into this quite a bit, the historical background. Greco-Roman women would display their status with their wealth, with their clothing, with their with what they would wear. And so this was very, very prominent, that you would go to the temple and you would display that wealth, that status. And so Paul is tapping into the attitude that's behind this. Paul's not after just the mere wearing of the particular kinds of clothes, and that's what he's just legislating and kind of that legalistic, okay, don't wear this, don't do this. No, Paul is getting at what's going on. What is the attitude behind this? And the attitude behind it is superiority, is arrogance, is self-promotion. And you can see that here with these, in the historical context with this. So in verse 9, when he's talking about dressing modestly, he's not talking about not having enough clothes on, okay? He's actually saying you got too much clothes on. You follow me? You're fancying up to the point that you're displaying yourself, and so what he's describing here is your attitude towards yourself, ladies, and this would apply to men as well. One writer describes this as the disposition of the soul, having the right view of oneself. And again, this is not just limited to what? Ephesus in the first century. So there'd be application for us today, right? Whether it's men, women, because there are parts of the world, even among men, I'm thinking about certain eastern countries like India and other places where men, you ever seen some of the men who are just, they're in the marketplace, in the grocery store, just on a Monday afternoon, they are dressed to the nines, right? Yes. And so it is in certain cultures, certainly with men as well, but anywhere this is found, not just, this could be applied today for men, for women, and so that's what he's dealing with. And then notice as he describes this here, let me go back here, let's get, he says you're to dress respectable, disciplined, well-arranged, honorable, sensible, modest. Now believe me, we've preached and teached on the modesty and not having enough clothes on and for dressing provocative and sexual, and I understand that. But here, this is the context here that he's describing in this sense of, by the way, this is the same word modest that is used to describe an elder, but the word is not translated modest. It says an elder is to be honorable in how he conducts himself. And that's the idea as well that Paul is saying. Both Paul and Peter would talk about this. All of this is on the emphasis of the inward person. The emphasis is not on the outward clothes That's the whole focus. That's not what the emphasis in. Peter says in 1 Peter 2 and verse 1 Peter 3, when he talks about these wives winning their unbelieving husbands, he says, when they see your purity and reverence of your lives, your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold and jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is great worth in the sight of God. The war is not against women wearing dresses and jewelry and fixing your hair. It's the misplacement on those things with your identity, and certainly in Ephesus, you're putting down others, that you are, what happens in James chapter 2? Remember, James describes an assembly context, and he says, a man walks in the assembly, and how's he dressed? Remember the first one? He's dressed what? Well, okay, yeah, but the first one is dressed all wealthy, right? And here's the thing about that. What I didn't understand when I was a little bit younger, but over the years, it's really, most of us are not going to have a lot of wealth, okay? That's just the reality. As I've gotten older, I've realized that. Not going to happen. I was watching this series on the History Channel recently. It's an older series called The Men Who Built America. These big titans, and J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and Carnegie and all these guys. And you're sitting there watching that and you're realizing, yeah, I'm never going to have money, But what do people want to do? If you can't have a lot of wealth yourself, what do you want to align yourself with? You want to kind of run with and run around with, work with, and align yourself with people who do have what? Wealth. And the hopes that maybe some of that will, spill over into you. But that's the idea here is, can't you see these prominent women who in the temple of Diana, many of them maybe have come out of the cult they were prophetesses, they were prominent people in that culture, and now they've been converted, and they're carrying that over, wanting to display that status and that position, and you can see how that's influencing the church. Have you ever seen that on a just practical level? Have you seen somebody do that, who displays themselves in such a way that it puts people down, it causes division? Yeah, it can still happen. And so this is the context of what I believe Paul is getting at here. And so, ladies, if any of you took off the jewelry or anything, started messing your hair up and not being all fixed up, you're okay, because I don't think that's what he's forbidding. He's commanding the disposition of the soul. And again, I think this emphasis is where things used to be and I think we've gotten so off track in our culture on the outward and the appearance, and we've neglected the inward character. And then he's going to talk about good works here. Let's look what he mentions here real quick. Verse 10. So we've talked about that a little bit. Disciplined, self-controlled, honorable. All of these are part of that. Yes, go ahead, Tony. Okay, go ahead. Matt? Yes, that's great. Yeah. The displaying of that was just unending. And here you come into the assembly, and there are literally, poor people, and they're wearing the same clothes and have very little. And we saw this even in the church at Corinth when you read 1 Corinthians. You remember what he says? The rich were enjoying a big old feast, remember? And the poor who didn't have any food, they were what? At their meals. They were going without. And so this was this division between the rich and the poor and status. Yeah, Tony? Right. Yeah, verse 10.
for lack of better terms, a not but phrase.
Right.
Jesus says the same thing uses that same phraseology in John chapter 6, verse 27, which says, don't work for food which perishes,
Right.
work for eternal life.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we have to work for food which perishes. We got to eat.
Right.
So we have to do that.
Yeah.
So he's not saying gold and braided hair, those things are wrong. He's saying focus on what's important. The
Yes.
spiritual inner part is what's important.
Absolutely.
Not the way we look. So
Yeah.
focus on the right thing.
Yeah.
That'll lead you right.
Absolutely. It is that verse 10, that contrast there, as Tony, leads us into that here's the contrast is the godliness, that professes godliness with good deeds. And so behavior that leads to good works. Good works are the focus, to be the focus. And he emphasizes that. He'll emphasize that again in verse 15, and we'll talk about verse 15 because we really have to understand that, or it can read really bad for women who, I couldn't have children. Does that mean I'm not saved? And so we'll talk about that. But he emphasizes this throughout the letter, chapter 5, verse 9 and 10, chapter 5 and verse 14 as well. Good works, godliness that professes itself to be good works. Do you remember the Dorcas in the book of Acts? Remember her, ladies? What was she? Remember at her funeral? What did the widows and people bring? Remember what she did? Stuff she had sewed, stuff she had made. She professed and displayed her godliness, her righteousness by her good deeds, by her behavior. Again, what does 1 Peter 2 tell those wives? Let it be the inner beauty, that gentle and quiet spirit that will be seen on the outside. It's clearly seen. You know, we live in a culture, and it's not just for, men, but now women. You've got to shout, and you've got to be aggressive, and you've got to, you got to grab it, and you've got to, bull your way in, and you've got to. This spirit is lashed hold on to Christians, and it's not. It doesn't make the gospel attractive when we preach it. And so he says here. And so this week I want you to think about, what if my actions, what if my words, what if my dress, what if my attitudes, everything, what if it was helping me be salt and light and a city on a hill that Jesus says, so that people will see, they do see us, okay, but who do their focus turn to when they see us displaying godliness and holiness, and they see our good deeds and they glorify and praise who? God in heaven. See, that's where the focus is at. It's not about us. It's not about us. It's about glorifying God and Jesus Christ. That's right. Jesus Christ, always the right answer. But he says that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So, by the way, that's going to move us out of legalistic thinking that says, well, it's not a sin. I can do this. I can wear this. I can go here. See, that's legalistic, actually. That moves into this, well, is it a sin? Is it right? Is it wrong? Let me tell you something. The Bible is much more concerned often with not just that letter of the law, but is what I'm doing, is it drawing people to Christ? Is it building others up? Is it influencing people for the kingdom of God? That is the emphasis. What I do, what I wear, what I say, is it pointing others to Jesus? And so you can easily get legalistic and say, well, it's not a sin, what I'm doing, it's nothing wrong, what I do. Yeah, but you didn't build anybody up. You didn't help somebody spiritually. You influenced them in a negative way. And so, yes, even though, Tony, I agree, sometimes it may be about the clothing, though. And maybe we're not wearing enough. Other times it may be we're wearing too much. Wearing too much. I mean, can you imagine going to places, certain parts of the world, and working with some of the poorest people on the planet and coming in there with, $500 suits, $1,000 suits, and pulling up in, $100,000 Mercedes? I mean, can you imagine? No. That would, and so it's more than just legalistically, is it right, is it wrong, is it building up, is it helping others, is it causing me to be a light and a salt and a city on a hill? And so that applies to all of us, men and women, and what we do. All right, well, go ahead and read verses 11 through 15. And women, if you've got any comments, I'm going to ask you to keep it to yourselves because it tells you to, no. Okay. Will pray for me, yeah. I mean, time we get to that, I'll be dead meat, and time we get to they'll be saved and childbearing, I mean, he won't have a preacher after that. So we'll talk about that next week.